All right, Revelation 13. So the last couple of times we've just gone through kind of big picture for the next section. Now we're going to look at more of a verse by verse type of thing. So the first part's about the beast from the sea, and we'll read the first couple of verses and then start working on some other passages that help explain this. So verse 1, and the dragon stood on the shore of the sea, and I saw a beast coming out of the sea. He had 10 horns and 7 heads, with 10 crowns on his horns, and on each head a blasphemous name. The beast I saw resembled a leopard, but had feet like those of a bear and a mouth like that of a lion. The dragon gave the beast his power and his throne and great authority. So, first thing that everybody notices is that he's got 10 horns and 7 heads, just like the dragon did in chapter 12. And if you look back at chapter 12, verse 3, if you need to refresh your memory, the dragon is described that way. 10 horns, 7 heads. The beast is not the dragon. They're clearly distinguished here. The beast is portrayed, or it's actually the passage portrays the dragon almost as if it's calling forth the beast. You see the dragon go stand on the shore of the sea, and then the beast rises out of the sea. And then the dragon gives the beast its power and authority. Not the dragon's power and authority, but the beast's power and authority is given to it, or derivative of the dragon, and the dragon is Satan. So what we have is a satanic empowered beast here. If we go to Daniel 7, we'll just look real quick at Daniel 7. We'll see something else about the beast. So Daniel 7, verse 3. Yes.
Are we on an outline?
We are.
We are.
Yes, we're on the one called Revelation 13, the 2 beasts. I sent it out several days. It's several pages. If you don't have a several page outline, then
I'm lost. Okay, let me look for it.
Yeah. Okay. It's probably 2 or 3 times ago, whatever, a week, within the last week and a couple of days, probably.
Times and half a times.
Times and half a times, right? 1,290 days. It's somewhere in there. Yeah.
Yeah, I found it. I saved it to my desktop.
Or minutes,
Or minutes, yeah. So Daniel 7, 3. Well, actually look at
start at 1.
Start in 1. In the first year of Belshazzar, just because Belshazzar is just a great name to pronounce, right? In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream, and visions passed through his mind as he was lying on his bed. He wrote down the substance of the dream. Daniel said, in my vision at night I looked, and there before me were the 4 winds of heaven churning up the great sea. 4 great beasts, each different from the others, came up out of the sea. The first was like a lion, and it had the wings of an eagle. I watched until its wings were torn off, and it was lifted from the ground, so that it stood on 2 feet like a man, and the heart of a man was given it. And there before me was a second beast, which looked like a bear. It was raised up on one of its sides, and it had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. It was told, get up and eat your fill of flesh. After that I looked, and there before me was another beast, one that looked like a leopard, and on its back it had 4 wings like those of a bird. This beast had 4 heads, and it was given authority to rule. After that, in my vision I looked, and there before me was a 4th beast, terrifying and frightening and very powerful. It had large iron teeth that crushed and devoured its victims and trampled underfoot whatever was left. It was different from all the former beasts, and it had 10 horns. So 4 beasts come up out of the sea here, and they're defined later in the chapter. We've looked at this chapter a couple times before, but later they're defined as Babylonia, which is the lion. That's the kingdom of Nebuchadnezzar, and Belshazzar. It's where Daniel currently is. That kingdom will be conquered by Medo-Persia. That's the second beast, the bear. And then later, about 330 BC, Greece will conquer Medo-Persia. And Greece is the leopard, the 3rd beast. And the 4th terrifying and frightening beast, which was not described as one of the animals or an animal, but just terrifying and frightening beast. It's an animal, but no type of animal is identified with it. This would be Rome, which conquered Greece in 63 BC. So we have the four beasts here coming out of the water, out of the sea, and they're described as animals, the first three, and we know that they refer to world powers, and specifically world powers whose history intersects with that of the Jewish people. And so if we go back to Revelation 13, we want to see here, we have beast I saw represented a leopard. I'm looking at verse 2, 13:2, had feet like those of a bear and a mouth like that of a lion. These are the first three beasts that Daniel saw, or at least these are parts of the first, these are attributes of the first three beasts that were seen in Daniel's vision. But they're being now used in a description of this terrifying beast that comes up out of the sea, which is the Roman Empire, the fourth beast of Daniel's vision. And it incorporates in it characteristics of all the previous empires, is basically the thought here. When we talked about who the beast from the sea is, or what it represents, I said that it had a generic identification, which was the Roman Empire. And so that's what we're getting right here. And then I had the specific identification with Nero, which you get in chapter 17. So that gives us the time period as well. But the beast here is described under the, in the same elements that are in Daniel's vision. So linking the two things together there. And then says it has blasphemous names on its heads. Chapter 13, verse 1 says he had 10 horns and 7 heads with 10 crowns on his horns, and on each head a blasphemous name. And if we look at chapter 17, verse 3, for this, I'm going to spend some time looking at the name written on his head. 17, verse 3, then the angel carried me away in the spirit into a desert, and there I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was covered with blasphemous names and had 7 heads and 10 horns. Same beast. And then the woman also has a name. We'll read on in verse 4. The woman was dressed in purple and scarlet and was glittering with gold, precious stones, and pearls. She held a golden cup in her hand, filled with abominable things and the filth of her adulteries. This title was written on her forehead: Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of prostitutes and the abominations of the earth. So both the beast on each of its heads has blasphemous names, and the woman has a name on her forehead as well. And this reminds us of the marking of God's people, the mark of the beast, and all of that, which I've kind of talked about before, but I'm going to go through some of that again right now, just so that we can see the connection. So the woman has a tiara, basically. She's got something on her head, and on it has this name. And the assumption then is the beasts also don't just have a name written on their forehead, but they're wearing crowns, and they're kings wearing crowns. But that's really not the important point. The important point is that they're identified by this thing on their forehead, this name on their forehead. So let's look back at Exodus 28:36. So Exodus 28:36 to 39. We read this a couple of weeks ago, I think. Make a plate of pure gold and engrave on it as a seal, holy to the Lord. Fasten a blue cord to it to attach it to the turban. It is to be on the front of the turban. It will be on Aaron's forehead, and he will bear the guilt involved in the sacred gifts the Israelites consecrate, whatever their gifts may be. It will be on Aaron's forehead continually, so that they will be acceptable to the Lord. So the names on the beast and the names on the name on the woman on their foreheads is actually presented as a kind of a mockery or a hellish counterpart to holy to the Lord. They're not holy to the Lord. They're abominable, blasphemous names. And so it's kind of a counterpart to this. And we have the idea of writing on the forehead. It's associated in the Revelation with both the seal of the living God, so a godly mark, and also the mark of the beast. And of course, these marks that we've seen on the beast himself and on the woman. So if we look at Revelation, back to the book of Revelation, we'll go to Revelation 7:3, and I'm going to kind of just go through these quickly, unless somebody's got a question or a comment, because we've seen these before. I just want to tie them all together here. So this is the 144,000, and this is them being sealed. And it says, do not harm in verse 3, chapter 7:3. Do not harm the land or the sea or the trees until we put a seal on the foreheads of the servants of our God. Then I heard the number of those who were sealed, 144,000 from all the tribes of Israel. So don't harm them. Don't execute judgment until we put a seal on the foreheads. So that, and then in chapter 14, verse 1, we'll look at that. Chapter 14, verse 1. Then I looked, and there before me was the Lamb standing on Mount Zion, and with him 144,000 who had his name and his father's name written on their foreheads. So we have a seal of ownership and identification is what this is, right? Identification and ownership. We are on the God team, not the beast team type of thing. Yes, Mom.
And if you go back to chapter 7, this is identified in verse 2. Then I saw another angel coming up from the east, having the seal of the living God, which the angel then puts on the believers, right?
Yeah. Very good. Very good. That's right. So just changing my outline so that I have that for the next time, if anybody ever asks me to teach this again.
If we ever get through with this one.
Well, we will get through with this outline probably. So 14:1, we see the 144,000 again. What they have is the name of the Father and the Lamb.
Now they have it.
Now they have it written on their foreheads. And then I'm getting a call from Simi Valley. That's not anybody I know, right, Steph? Nope. Okay. Who knows? All right. So we're looking at Revelation 22:4. These are we'll start in verse 1. Then the angel showed me the river of the water of life, as clear as crystal, flowing from the throne of God and of the Lamb down the middle of the great street of the city. On each side of the river stood the tree of life, bearing 12 crops of fruit, yielding its fruit every month. And the leaves of the tree are for the healing of the nations. No longer will there be any curse. The throne of God and of the Lamb will be in the city, and his servants will serve him. They will see his face, and his name will be on their foreheads. There will be no more night. They will not need the light of a lamp or the light of the sun, for the Lord God will give them light, and they will reign forever and ever. So God's servants have God's name on their foreheads. But the woman has an abominable name on her foreheads, as does the beast in all of his heads. And then we, of course, have the mark of the beast, which is Revelation 13:16-18. So this section is about the beast out of the earth, who's now promoting the worship of the beast out of the sea. And verse 16. He, that is the beast out of the earth, also forced everyone, small and great, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on his right hand or on his forehead, so that no one could buy or sell unless he had the mark, which is the name of the beast or the number of his name. And then it goes on and says 666, which we've talked about before. But do you see how the idea of having the name on the forehead, it stems from the high priest, his turban, and now it's applied to all of God's people, and also to all of those who are against God's people, against God and his people, including the great enemies of the church. Everybody has a name on them, on their forehead. So I just want to look at Ezekiel 9 again. So in Ezekiel 9, 3 through 6. And this is an echo of the first passage in Revelation that talks about sealing, which is Revelation 7, 2 and 3. Here's verse 3 again. Do not harm the land or the sea or the trees until we put a seal on the foreheads of the servants of our God. Here's Ezekiel 9, verse 3. Now the glory of the God of Israel went up from above the cherubim where it had been and moved to the threshold of the temple. So it's moving out of the temple. The cherubim is at the Holy of Holies. Then the Lord called to the man clothed in linen who had the writing kit at his side and said to him, go throughout the city of Jerusalem and put a mark on the foreheads of those who grieve and lament over all the detestable things that are done in it. Basically, as you read through the chapter, what you see is that the Lord has decreed judgment on Jerusalem, but he says to the man, so there are avenging angels and there's a man with a writing kit. And the Lord says to the man with a writing kit, put a mark on all the foreheads of the people who grieve over the sins. So God's people who are tortured by the sins here. And he tells the executing angels to stay their hand until all the people have been marked. And so it's the parallel passage, Revelation 7 is parallel with this. So the mark is very similar then to Passover mark, right? Because what's happening in the Ezekiel passage is that God's people are being marked so that the avenging angel passes over them and doesn't take them in the judgment. And that's the same meaning in all of the places where God's people are marked, is that they are reserved, set aside, and they don't face the judgment, and not guaranteeing physical protection, but spiritual life. Then I think we've talked about the mark of the beast being on the right hand and the forehead. Does everybody remember that? We talked about that. We looked at passages in Deuteronomy where it says, put the law of God and write them down on your forehead, put it on your forehead and on your hand. Those are those passages, Deuteronomy 6:11 and Exodus 13. But I do want to look at, under point number 7 there, the passage in Zechariah 14:20 to 21. So Zechariah is the second to the last book in the Old Testament. Go to Malachi and then back up. Zechariah 14:20 and 21. This is talking about the particular day it's talking about is a day in the far future from Zechariah, where the Messiah will have already come, and the nations will be coming in to worship him. And at the conclusion of all this, here's the conclusion. On that day, verse 20, on that day, holy to the Lord will be inscribed on the bells of the horses and the cooking pots in the Lord's house. Oh, sorry, let me read that again. On that day, holy to the Lord will be inscribed on the bells of the horses, and the cooking pots in the Lord's house will be like the sacred bowls in front of the altar. Every pot in Jerusalem and Judah will be holy to the Lord Almighty, and all who come to sacrifice will take some of the pots and cook in them. And on that day, there will no longer be a Canaanite or a merchant but in the house of the Lord Almighty. So the house will be clean and pure, as far as no Canaanites or merchants, depending on how you understand the translation there. Only God's people. And the thing about on the horses' bridles will be written holy to the Lord. And the thing about every pot and utensil will be holy to the Lord. This is what's written on the forehead of the high priest. And then that's what the allusion is to. That's what the echo is. It's the echo of the Exodus passage where the high priest's turban is described, holy to the Lord. But not only is now the high priest holy to the Lord, but even the horses' bridles and the pots and the forks are holy to the Lord. The holiness, this dedication, this consecration, this sanctification to the Lord now extends from the high priest, who is the representative of God's people before God, who in the typology is Jesus, all the way down to everything that is used in the kingdom. And that would include all the people. That would include all the people of the kingdom.
When is this?
Well, this is the and again, different eschatological views are going to answer it differently. This, to me, my understanding is that this is the result of the fulfillment of Psalm 110:1, which is the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make all your enemies a footstool. This is the result of every knee will bow and every tongue will confess. This is the glory of the Lord will cover the earth like the waters cover the sea. So this would be, on my view, something that is, on that view, it is something that is progressively in progress and that we're nearing as time goes on.
The enemies have not yet been made a footstool.
Not all of them.
Because the enemies, among other things, refers to death.
Right. Death is the last enemy. So there's a disagreement. I guess you could sum up, this is not the most common way of understanding the difference between, say, postmillennialism and amillennialism. Postmillennialism would say, okay, let's say this. Everybody agrees that this passage is talking about a future time, and it will certainly occur. Postmillennialists, so there's a line that divides history from eternity. Right at the very end of history, there's a line that divides the end of history. That's the end of history. Here's history, here's eternity. Postmillennialists would put the fulfillment of this passage right before that line. And amillennialists would put it right after. So to say that in another way, postmillennial eschatology is the kingdoms of this world will become the kingdoms of our Lord and of his Christ. And that will happen in history. That's a postmillennial view. An amillennial view is that will happen. And it will be the result of, it'll be the result of Christ returning, not the prelude. So, and then, of course, then premillennialists who have the millennium and all that, they would put these types of passages being fulfilled in the millennial kingdom, so that after Christ returned, but before the eternal state.
Not coincidence with it, but some period of time after his return.
Right. Right. So of the three options that I just outlined, the two that I think can be the two which are the most similar and are hard to decide upon between the biblical views, looking at the biblical evidence, I think are postmillennialism and amillennialism. This now Augustine, who was a postmillennialist, Augustine would say that Augustine believed in a 1,000-year kingdom on earth prior to the second coming, which is not what premillennialists believe. Premillennialists believe Jesus comes back and then there's a 1,000-year. So Augustine was postmillennialist. There's a 1,000-year kingdom on earth, and it has all of these glorious prophecies being fulfilled in it, and then Jesus returns at the end. Modern postmillennialists have dropped the 1,000 years. They don't say it's 1,000 years. They say the kingdom of Christ has been growing since the first century and is growing now. So Augustine was able to incorporate the 1,000 years because he lived in 400 AD, and so he was, he was
It was
thinking
still plausible.
he was thinking around the year 1,000 is when Jesus would come back. But yeah, once you start getting into 1100 AD, 1200 AD, eschatology changes.
Hmm.
So it's an interesting phenomenon. But anyway, does that kind of make sense what I said about the passage and how people put it in the different cases? Everybody locates it in the future. Yeah, Mom.
So which is your view?
So I am postmillennial. So my view is that all of Christ's enemies, excepting death, all of Christ's enemies will be put under his feet before he returns. And there's a couple of passages. We'll look at just one, and you can tell me what you think about it, you guys. It's Hebrews 10. Let's see. It's probably Hebrews 12. It's an important passage, and I can't remember where it is. Let's see.
You remind me of me.
Yeah, let's see. That's funny. I know it's in the book of Hebrews 10 or 12. Let's see if I can find it really quick. Okay, yeah, it is chapter 10. This is why I get confused. It's chapter 10, verse 12. 12 and 13. So this is talking about, obviously, the high priest and his ministry, and it's going to relate it to Christ. So starting in verse 11. Day after day, every priest stands and performs his religious duties. Again and again, he offers the same sacrifices, which can never take away sins. But when this priest had offered for all time one sacrifice for sins, he sat down at the right hand of God. Since that time, he waits for his enemies to be made his footstool, because by one sacrifice he has been made perfect forever, or he has made perfect forever those who are being made holy. So verse 12 and 13, he sat down at the right hand of God. This is, and then the reference to enemies being made a footstool. This is a reference to Psalm 110, verse 1. And it says that in verse 13, since he sat down, since that time he waits for his enemies to be made his footstool. The question is, what is he waiting for? What is he waiting to do? The passage doesn't say, what he's waiting to do or what he's waiting for, but he's waiting, and when his enemies are put under his foot, then he will do whatever it was he was waiting for. And the only explanation that people have been able to offer for what he's waiting for, I think, is he's waiting to return. So anyway, so that passage, and you can then link it with other passages. That passage is admittedly not as clear as postmillennialists would like it, but it is in light of the fact that there's no other plausible explanation that's been offered. You look at the passage and go, well, yeah, he's waiting. He's going to come back, and then, 1 Corinthians 15 says about the same thing. I mean, almost exactly the same. Real quick look at that, and then 1 Corinthians 15, 21 to 24, I think it is. Paul's great chapter on the resurrection of the dead, starting in verse 20. But Christ has indeed been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. For since death came through a man, the resurrection of the dead comes also through a man. For as in Adam all die, so in Christ all will be made alive, but each in his own turn. Christ the first fruits, and then, when he comes, those who belong to him. And then the end will come, when he hands over the kingdom to God the Father, after he has destroyed all dominion, authority, and power. When's the end? When he comes.
Yeah.
And when does he come? Well, he comes after he's destroyed all dominion, because at the end he hands over the kingdom to the Father. And so the very last enemy to destroy is death. And when does that happen? When he comes, the resurrection occurs, death is destroyed. Prior to that, if death is the last enemy to be destroyed, we didn't read that part, but we should. Verse 25. Well, let's start in 24 again. Then the end will come, when he hands over the kingdom to God the Father, after he has destroyed all dominion, authority, and power. For he must reign until he has put all his enemies under his feet. The last enemy to be destroyed is death. The last enemy.
Why then be under his feet?
Yeah. So when Christ comes back, what happens simultaneously with that is the resurrection. It's at that point that the final enemy is destroyed. The resurrection destroys death. If death is the last enemy and the destruction of death occurs at the second coming, then all the other enemies have already been subdued. So that's the logic of a postmillennial understanding. That's the logic of it.
Thank you.
Yeah. So, but everybody you have to think about it yourself and work on it. Postmillennialism is compelling to me and many others, but it is by no means the most popular of the eschatological views.
Yeah.
It was once or twice in the past, but not right now, and not for the last 100 and 200 years, something like that. So, but we don't determine what our interpretation is by counting noses, right? Saying, oh, 6 people believe that, it must be true. So, anyway, it's a really great study. The other question that makes me postmillennial is, the Great Commission, go out and make disciples of every nation, teaching them to observe the things that I've commanded you. Did Jesus expect that to be fulfilled?
Yes.
Well, then I think you're stuck with postmillennialism. So, all right. What time is it? It must be, we started late at 10:21. Okay, so the source of the power and authority, we're on 1B. We talked about that. The source of the beast's power and authority is the dragon. Let's look at Revelation 13:3, the mortal wound, or the apparent mortal wound. This has been nothing definitive on this one, but there have been some suggestions. Revelation 13:3, one of the heads of the beast seemed to have a fatal wound, but the fatal wound had been healed, and the whole world was astonished and followed the beast. Then worshipped the dragon because he had given authority to the beast, and they also worshipped the beast and asked, who is like the beast, who can make war against him? So the great thing about the beast here is that he does a resurrection, right? He either was killed and came back to life, or it looked like he was killed and then he looked like he came back to life. In either case, there was a fatal or near fatal blow, and then a recovery, a miraculous recovery. And this makes the whole world go, wow, look at that. Pretty amazing stuff. So these are the suggestions. A couple of the suggestions here. One was perhaps the head is the Caesar dynasty. That was started by Julius Caesar, and he was murdered, but that did not end the Caesar dynasty, surprisingly.
Really the beginning, wouldn't it?
Yeah, the beginning. He was the beginning, right? Caesar starts the Caesar dynasty, but then his murder would seem to logically would have ended it, but then his nephew takes the reins of the empire. But there was no political turmoil or anything after that. It was just basically a coup. Caesar gets assassinated and someone steps in place.
At two, Brutus.
Yeah, Nero is also been suggested. We already know he's the contemporary expression of the beast. We see that in chapter 17. We also see that with the number 666. His suicide on June 9th, 68 AD, almost caused the Roman Empire to collapse. But Vespasian's rise to power brought stability to the empire. Vespasian was initially the general who was in charge of the siege of Jerusalem. And then when Nero committed suicide, the empire, as I said here, was thrown into political turmoil, and it looked like it was going to actually disappear. And there was a series of emperors after that, and they lasted a very short time until the army made Vespasian the emperor. And at that time, Vespasian turned over the battle of Jerusalem to his son Titus. So Vespasian became emperor after he died. He was emperor for 10 years. After he died, his son Titus became the emperor. Here's a quote from Steve Gregg. He's a contemporary writer writing in the book 4 Views of Revelation, a parallel commentary. Even if Nero is the head mortally wounded, it is not he who personally survives the wound, but the beast that survives the wounding of one of its heads. At the death of Nero, the Roman Empire was thrown into violent convulsions of civil war and anarchy in which 3 emperors succeeded one another within a single year. Historians consider it astonishing that the empire stabilized and survived this period that might easily have spelled out the end of imperial rule. Thus, the recovery of the empire under Vespasian was a marvel to all. The beast of the empire had survived the mortal wounding of one of its heads. And I've got I've got attached to this some quotations about the stability of the empire on the death of Nero, written by contemporary historians or historians that lived within 50 years of the events. And we're writing the history of either the Caesars or the empire. And this is what Steve Gregg is summarizing, is these. And we don't have time to look at them today, but I think maybe we'll look at them on Tuesday. There's also a belief called Nero redivivus, which is interesting. It means Nero revived. And there was a belief, we'll just read the next thing I wrote. So I'm on page 2.3. Many commentators who favor a date for the composition of Revelation after the fall of Jerusalem, so a late date, explain this passage about the mortal wound by appealing to the Nero redivivus myth, which, quote, was a belief popular during the last part of the 1st century that the Roman Emperor Nero would return after his death in 68 AD. The legend was a common belief as late as the 5th century. end quote. So there was a belief, a rumor, a legend that Nero would return. And there was actually, even up into the 5th century, there were people who were hopefully expecting Nero to return because, the Christians, he was a horrible emperor. But to the Roman people, he had brought stability and prosperity and things like that. And so he was looked at not as the best emperor they ever had, but as one of the powerful emperors. And Rome's all about power. And so they're looking for Nero to come back.
He's better than Caligula anyway.
Right, better than Caligula. And apparently better than all the ones that came after him too, because they were still expecting Nero to show up and wanting him to come back. So, it's almost mind-boggling. I can't figure that out because he was, every time a comet came through the sky, he'd kill aristocrats and, as an offering and stuff like that. So he's a weird guy. But the thing that's interesting about this, I've always found this really interesting, is that so people who date the book of Revelation like I do before the fall of Jerusalem, we say, well, this is about Nero. And you would think that people who date the book later than the fall of Jerusalem, after Nero is dead, that they would say this isn't about Nero, this is about something that happened after Nero. But what actually they say is, this is about Nero.
In his resurrection.
In his resurrection. It's about the rumor that Nero would come back from the dead. And so the wounded beast the head is Nero. That's the way they interpret it. And so it turns out that everybody interprets it, not, in this small group, everybody of late date commentators who appeal to the Nero redivivus myth and early date commentators, everybody says that's Nero. And I find that to be really an interesting thing. You often see that even though they disagree on the particulars, they still have the same starting point of the interpretation. So it's always fun when your interpretation is also confirmed by people who disagree with you. So I find that. So we have the same thing with the dispensational interpretation. A standard dispensational understanding is that the beast is the revived Roman Empire, and that the head that was mortally wounded is the Antichrist, who was assassinated and then rose from the dead. So the beast is the revived Roman Empire in the dispensational scheme, meaning that dispensationalists are expecting Rome to be a power again, and that from this power will come a world leader who they say is the Antichrist, and that Antichrist will be killed and then will rise from the dead. But the interesting thing is that the beast is Rome. It's again, they come to the same conclusion. They just say it's a revived Rome. And so it's very interesting.
Well, the Roman Empire did continue to flourish after Nero.
Yeah, it fell in 410. Well, it started to fall in 410 and ended falling within 30 or 40 years of that. And so the Roman Empire survives Nero, which is the point of the preterist interpretation. The preterist interpretation is Nero's death sends the empire into this instability where it looks like it's going to fall, but it doesn't. And that the whole world is amazed, the whole world being the whole Roman world. I mean, that's got to be a big blow to your country, right? Imagine if we had 3 presidents, one president commits suicide, and then 3 presidents are assassinated within a year. What would that do for our stability?
Yeah, kind of rocket.
Yeah, that would just, you can imagine, what that must have felt like. And what it must have, economically, the impact of that would just be devastating.
A lot of people thought that that's what was going to happen when Trump lost the election.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
The end of the world.
End of the world. Yeah. So it's not hard to imagine the situation. We've never had a president commit suicide. That itself would be a big blow to the confidence that people have in the presidency and in the government. But then just to have this anarchy where it's like Old Testament conditions, right? Where this king rises and then somebody kills him and then somebody kills that guy and then somebody kills that guy, except it's compressed into a 1-year period.
And so we would assume that we may be able to assume that of those 3 that or 4 that were murdered, that the military did not support any of them.
Correct. Right. The military ended up supporting Vespasian after the third guy comes into power after Nero. The military basically tells Vespasian that they want to make him emperor, and then they kill the reigning emperor and put Vespasian in there. So Vespasian,
You know what his name? Do you know the name of that?
Vitellius, I think it might have been. There were 3. I don't remember which
Well, then-
order, but I think it's Galba, Otho, Vitellius.
That's a mouthful.
Yeah. So in regards to so this is what happens when Nero commits suicide. Empire goes into turmoil. 3 emperors. Right before the assassination of the 3rd emperor, the army says to Vespasian, "We're going to make you emperor." He starts going back. He leaves Jerusalem because he's in charge of the siege there. He leaves Jerusalem to go back to the empire, go back to Rome, where that emperor is murdered and Vespasian then is installed. When Vespasian leaves, he turns over the army and the siege to Titus during that interim period there where there's this handoff. The siege conditions are loosened slightly and the Christians all leave Jerusalem. And that's why there were and in fulfillment of what Jesus said, when you see the abomination, the desolation, the army surrounding Jerusalem, then get out. Which would seem like it would be too late. When the armies are surrounding Jerusalem, get out. But it turns out that that's exactly what happened. The armies were surrounding Jerusalem and they had just taken their eye off Jerusalem for a little bit during this handoff. Christians get out, city's sealed back up. And so that's what happened. Those are how those events are all related. Then let me just go over the very last thing here, and then we'll stop for today because it's 10:34. So number 0.7 on page 2, idealist interpreters. Idealists are the ones that are not looking for historical fulfillments usually, but are looking for principles. Idealist interpreters usually argue that Nero, in his capacity as persecutor of the church, was the head that was wounded, and that he was revived in the person of Domitian, who it is argued was the next great persecutor of the church. Most idealist interpreters that I've encountered are late date, and they believe the revelation was written under Domitian, who's the emperor just named here, and that the visions of persecution were about the persecutions in Domitian's time period. However, now, and at least for the last 30 years or so, it's generally known and agreed among Christian scholars that there was no great persecution under Domitian. There's no evidence for it.
You mean in our past 30 years?
Yeah, our past 30 years, 30, maybe even 50 years.
Oh, okay.
Actually, I have commentaries from like 1972 that say there's no evidence for Domitian. But that's about when started. And now in the amillennial camp, they're going to need to change this interpretation eventually. But it's interesting, again, Nero is still named in this interpretation, even though Domitian is the revival of Nero. So it's so everybody comes back to Rome, everybody comes back to Nero eventually, which is interesting. So I think we probably should stop there, and we'll look at the times and half a times, 42 months. We'll start with that on Tuesday. If you have time over the weekend, read the quotes that I attached, which start on page 6, I think. Yeah, looks like that. Yeah, start on page 6. Oh, and Don, on page 5, there's a list of the emperors, and I was right. It's Galba, Otho, and Vitellius, followed by Vespasian.
Ah, yes.
Yeah. So, okay. Anybody have any closing thoughts?
I didn't remember. I forgot that Claudius. I was thinking that he had a fairly short reign, but actually it's 13 years or thereabouts. Hmm.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's, interesting time period. Glad we don't live in that time period, but interesting. Right.